This is a little bit different, but basically, just like I said, we're going to take this piece and make it the same size as this. And so one way to do that would be to do pleats, but we don't want to do pleats. We want a different kind of fullness. So this would be for skirts. This technique we're actually going to use on the cap of a sleeve. Basically, anytime we want to take something and make it fit into something else, we turn our sewing machines up to a basting stitch, a number 5 stitch, and within our seam allowance, so we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this piece, but within that, I would say a hefty 1/4 inch. So not skimpy, but not too much. Oops, we're going to baste our stitch. Now don't back stitch if you're basting. And we're gonna do 1 row of stitching like this. And again, don't back stitch this time because we're gonna need it. Leave a nice tail. And then you're gonna do a 2nd row right next to it. Whether you do that row on the outside or the inside, I don't care, as long as it's within the 1/2 inch. We don't want to see this stitch. You'll see why I mean that in a second, but basically, if you don't feel like you can get it too close, then you can do these closer to the edge. Number 5 stitch goes a lot faster, so just be careful when you're doing this. You don't want to cross over your stitches. We're going to use these stitches as sort of like a ripcord or a like a drawstring. So what we're going to do is these 2 stitches, and it's important that you do 2, and I'll tell you why in a second. You're going to pull 2 of the tails. The tails are going to be from the top or the bottom. It doesn't matter which, as long as they're from the same side. You can't pull the 2, one top, one bottom, because then they're going to not go anywhere. That's the whole point of it. So if you pull from the top or the bottom, what happens is it treats it like a drawstring, or like I said, like some sort of kind of ripcord. And you're going to just kind of smooth that out. Try not to break the threads, because then you got to start over. But you're going to ruffle this up until it gets to be the size of this. And you can pull from the other side too. If you can't go all the way across, that's fine. Just be gentle. Again, you don't want to pull too hard because you can rip your piece, your thread rather. And what you want to do is try and evenly distribute those gathers. So if you have a lot in the edges or at the center, you can move them around. They're sort of fluid on that piece once you've actually done that. Depending on what kind of skirt you're doing, your gathers might be all in one place or actually spread out. But you're going to just make sure that it's the same length, and you can always make it longer if you have to. And I'm gonna pin this one because it's kind of unruly. So you want your raw edges to still be matched up. So basically what I'm doing is I'm sewing a ruffled piece into a flat piece. And the 2 rows of stitching is important because the space between the number 5 stitch is even, and we don't really want it to look too even. We want it to look a little bit more organic and kind of ruffly. And so if it's all even, it just doesn't look as good. The other reason is that if one of your threads breaks, you can still do the ruffle with just 1 thread. If you have to, it's not ideal, but that is just also a safety precaution. The 2 threads are a little stronger than 1. So I'm going to now sew this at a 1/2 inch with a regular stitch length on the outside of what those preliminary stitches were. I don't want to see those, so when I open my seam up, if those are beyond my stitching, I'm going to see those on my actual garment. So I'm going to stitch at a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to stitch from the side that has the gathers, okay? And as I'm going to make sure that those gathers don't get folded over too much like that, and don't get folded and don't get too flat, because I want them to be nice and gathered looking. So if I kind of keep pulling on them and stop as I go and just kind of readjust them, watch your fingers here, don't get your fingers caught, then your gathers will end up being beautiful little perfect gathers. And again, you see how I'm stitching on this side so that these are actually just left in my seam allowance. You can remove those gathering stitches afterwards if you want, but it isn't necessary. And for your sample, I'm gonna ask that you leave them so that I know that you did it. I'll still know if you didn't do it because I'll see how it looks, but it does help me to see whether or not you actually got them in the right spot. It's not the end of the world if one of these gathering stitches does fall out on the side of your garment. I should have showed you guys, because you can just pick it out. We no longer need these gathering stitches. So like I said, you can pull them out if you don't want to see them. but we don't have to. And so when you open this up, you press this flat, and that's how you make a little gathered skirt. So the idea would be you would make this into a waistband. I don't want you to seal it up because I want to see it, but you would do the same thing on this one, and that would be essentially your waistband for a skirt. Do you have any questions on the gathers and pleats? Okay. So the pleats are more of a pressing